Hey, this is Pascal Finette. I'm the co-founder of Be Radical and the chair for entrepreneurship and open innovation at Singularity University. And it is my great pleasure and honor to be here today with you and talk about the future. Now, as we're talking about the future, here's the most important thing I can tell you about the future. The future is invisible. It is unwritten. We don't know what the future will be. And as our futurist friends at Stanford have defined long ago, there's a concept we have when we think about the future, which is called the cone of uncertainty. And that cone of uncertainty essentially says that, of course, you know what tomorrow will look like. And you have a good sense of what the next week will look like or the month after that. But the further out you go into the future, the wider your space of possibilities becomes, the wider your option space becomes. And inside of that cone of possibilities is a smaller cone of probable futures. And I do believe that as leaders in this world, as leaders today, particularly today, it is our imperative, it is our objective to actually define what the outer boundaries of these cones look like and explore these and then chart our course inside of this cone of probable futures. Now, I want to acknowledge a thing here. We used to think about the world in three distinct time horizons: the now, the next, and the beyond. The now is what you do today. The next is the 2 to 5 year out time frame. And the beyond was the future, the far out future. And of course, we're living in a world which is shaped by COVID-19. We will not talk about COVID-19 all that much today, but one thing COVID-19 has done, it has remarkably compressed the time frames in which we are living. And I'm pretty sure you're feeling this right now. What used to be two distinct time frames, the now and the next, has really compressed into a singular point in time, the right now, right here. And what used to be the world of beyond the 10-year out is now really the question of what happens beyond COVID. With that being said, everything you need to know, I can summarize in a single slide. And I'm pretty sure you've seen that slide before. It is, of course, the exponential curve. Technology moves on these curves. Just think about Gordon Moore, who said 50 years ago that computers are doubling in their capacity every 2 years, which clearly has been the driver of much of the change we're seeing in the world. You know this. But here's the thing. If you're standing somewhere where this gentleman stands, and I would postulate that in many technologies, and we'll explore this further in this session today. When you stand somewhere where this gentleman stands and you look to the past looks flat and linear. If you have the ability to see the future has this weird look. It is strange and steep. And Ernest Hemingway wrote a book. In this book, the book is called The Sun Also Rises. In this book, he has got a beautiful quote. We really love this quote. The shortest version of this quote we now call the Hemingway law of motion, because it describes this feeling, this point where you're standing so well. It says gradually and then suddenly. What we see over and over and over again is that technology creeps up on us and it seems to come out of nowhere. And then suddenly it changes the world. Just think about the smartphone, which is a good example for this. So this brings us to my main point. I do believe that it is imperative on us to, if we want to make sense of the future, to understand the early part of this curve, the early stage of this exponential curve. And we call this weak signals. These are the early signs. And I want to sharpen your senses towards the weak signals a little bit by going through a couple of technologies. And we start with compute, because compute, of course, is the mother of all exponential trends. And I don't really need to tell you that the phone in your pocket, be it an iPhone or an Android phone, today is as powerful as a supercomputers in the 70s. You all know that, but I want to show you something really interesting. This here is a digital pregnancy test. And a little while ago, a hacker saw this digital pregnancy test, which costs $3. And it's a one-use device. You use it once, you throw it away. He became really curious about this. And curiosity is a powerful skill in this new world. And he asked himself, man, I want to know what's inside of this thing. So he bought one, $3. He opened it up. And of course, there's a little computer in there. And then he looked at the little computer. And just to remind you, this is a throwaway device. So just to say how far we have come, we're living in a world where we have computers which we're using once and then throw them away. You know, imagine this in the 80s. But he asked himself a powerful question. He asked himself, how powerful is the chip which is on this particular device? Again, $3. And what he found is that the chip on this device has the same compute power as the original IBM PC, which of course, coupled with Microsoft DOS, changed the world of computing. So now you have in a throwaway device, which costs less than $3 for the whole device, and the chip only costs 50 cents. You have the same compute power as you had in the original PC. And because, of course, we are a hacker, we put the game of Doom onto our digital pregnancy test. So now you can play Doom, a round of Doom on your digital pregnancy test. But here's where this matters. And this is where I want you to get curious about the weak signals, because the question you want to ask yourself is, what is this a weak signal for? When you look at the world of computing, computers used to be these big roomfuls of electronics, and then they became smaller. And they became so small that you could put them into your briefcase. And then they became so small that you could put them into your pocket. And every single time this happened, every single time we made the computer smaller and smaller and smaller, the world changed and massive opportunities emerged. And we are at the brink of another one of those changes where computers are becoming truly what we call ambient. They become just a fabric. They become everything and everywhere, and they're just free. They're so cheap that you don't even think about throwing them away after using them one time. And again, I postulate that the world will change more so. And then, of course, we see, and I don't have the time to go into all the details here, but I just want to sharpen your senses for all the weak signals we're seeing. So we see this in the world of artificial intelligence and algorithms. And again, much has been written about this, and I'm sure you have heard a lot about it. We see it in the world of the blockchain and cryptocurrencies. We see it in the world of quantum computing, where companies like Microsoft are making breakthroughs, true breakthroughs in the world of quantum computing. And we see it in the world of genetic engineering, the world which brought us the COVID vaccine, being able to develop a vaccine within days and having it on the market in less than 1 year. And then we're also seeing it in adjacent fields like energy. Our transition towards fully renewable energies is well on its way. And then, of course, COVID happened. And COVID has accelerated a whole bunch of those weak signals. Remember, gradually and then suddenly. So gradual changes we're seeing, which now suddenly have been accelerated in the world of travel, in the world of education. If you have kids at home, you know exactly what I mean. It's like we're suddenly like all glued to our screens and learning in front of our screens, which was unthinkable until relatively recently. And then we've seen it in the world of fashion. Here's a really interesting question. When was the last time you saw someone wear a tie? I honestly can't remember. It must have been before March last year, before we got into this whole lockdown situation. So if you happen to be a tie maker, unfortunately, your world has changed in very dramatic and not very fortunate ways. If you happen to be a friend of mine who makes sweatpants, so comfortable jogging pants, your pants are flying off your digital shelves. You can't make pants enough. Or think about the world of remote work. Remote work, of course, was with us before COVID, but it's also one of those things which has accelerated dramatically since we are moving into the world of COVID. We went from 0% or 2% or whatever the number was in terms of remote work in your particular environment to nearly 100%. And that brings up interesting questions about the future. And I want to sharpen your senses for those interesting questions by looking at one more topic which I'm particularly interested in, which is food delivery. Food delivery is a really fascinating topic. In the United States, pre-COVID, only about 30%, 20 to 30% of households used food delivery services for groceries and meals. COVID hits, of course, that number jumps up to about 80%, which is a pretty dramatic increase. Now, here's two powerful questions you want to ask yourself about these weak signals every time you encounter them. Question number one is, what is the residue of those changes as the circumstances change? So how much will that number go down? Think about food delivery, think about remote work, think about fashion, for example, when we get out of COVID. And I guarantee you the number will not be the more small number it was before. It is going to be a much higher number. Remote work is a good example. We used to have what, like 2-3% of our workforce being in a remote work environment. It shoots up to nearly 100% of workforce in the lockdown, in the hardest of the lockdowns. And it will go down clearly not to 2% anymore. It will go down to whatever the number will be, 20, 30, 40%. And that will lead to massive changes and massive opportunities. The second question is, what are the auxiliary changes, the changes which are triggered by this? And here's an interesting one. This is the grocery aisle in a local supermarket. Look at the bottles. This is milk bottles. They are optimized for shelf space display. They're made for you to look at them and say, man, they're so luscious, look so good. I want to put them into my basket. But that's not true anymore, because now we're shipping the stuff. And when you ship it, we need different types of packaging because these things are horrible to ship. So I postulate that one of the interesting consequences of this will be that we will see companies which will make packaging which will look dramatically different. This is a good friend of ours, Guy Kawasaki. He was the first evangelist at Apple, and he gave me a powerful question about the future, and I want to give that to you because it's so beautiful. He asks himself, when he sees something which is out of the norm, a weak signal, isn't that interesting? And I want you to use that question because it's a perfect question. It's a perfect inquiry into the future to figure out what the future could look like. Now, not every weak signal will turn into a strong signal. And I want to give you a framework, simple framework, to figure this out. Now, here's our friend, the exponential curve. The blue line is your expectation. In the beginning, you want technology to be better, and you're disappointed. All technologies have the same fate. You see something in the very early days, you're getting super excited about it, but it doesn't actually live up to the hype. Eventually, it gets better, and you get to this, what we call the iPhone moment, and then technology gets better and better and better, and then you get into chaos and amazement where you can't keep up with the changes you see in the world. Now, here's the first insight. It takes years, often decades, for technology to mature. So the good news is you've got time. The bad news is the moment the lines are crossing, you have no time whatsoever because the markets are being made so quickly today. So you need to get the timing right. But it is not just the timing of the core of the technology, but it's also something we like to call Gestalt. And Gestalt is a German word. It's a weird German word. It's the collection of all the other physical, biological, psychological, or symbolic entities which make up the whole. A good way to think about the idea of Gestalt is, what are the other, not the core of the technology, but what are the other scientific and technological breakthroughs, the environmental and economic breakthroughs, and the political and social breakthroughs which need to happen for a technology to be successful. Because technologies don't happen by themselves. There's things you can influence. This is the technology at its core. And then there's things you cannot influence, and that is all the other things. So you need to look out for the timing of the technology and the Gestalt, because you can be too early, you clearly can be too late, but it's much easier to be too early because we get so excited about technology in the beginning. But that's not enough. You also need to look at the problem space. And the problem space, we like to look through three lenses. What is the frequency, density, and friction of the problem? How often do you encounter the problem? Frequency. How much time do you spend in the problem space? Density. How much pain does it cause you? Friction. Because if those three aren't high enough, you might have a solution, and even the timing and the Gestalt might be right, but there is no problem. So the way you want to look at any of these weak signals, and this is a super simple framework we have developed for you, is to use this canvas. Look at what is the timing, what is the Gestalt of this of the particular weak signal you're looking at. Say, for example, the blockchain or self-driving cars or artificial intelligence. And what is the frequency, density, and the friction of those? Now, all of this leads to disruption. And when we talk about disruption, it's a term everybody likes to throw around, and I want to demystify this a tiny bit. So this is the oldest definition I could find about disruption. This is Webster's dictionary from 1913, more than 100 years ago. And they said disruption is a state of being rent asunder or broken into pieces. And when we talk about disruption, we tend to talk about these three companies, Kodak, Blockbuster, and Nokia. And if you're anything like me, if you hear these stories one more time, you just want to throw up in your mouth a little bit because you're so sick and tired. Because the story is always the same. Kodak got disrupted by the digital camera and Instagram ultimately. Blockbuster got disrupted by Netflix. Nokia gets disrupted by the smartphone. Now, we all heard those stories, and we see these companies, the disruptor, as the companies we need to study. But here's what I postulate: the actual job to be done never changes. That's a really fascinating thing. You're still watching movies. They just don't happen to be on a VHS videotape, which you get from a store. They get now streamed to your television set. You're still taking pictures. You're actually taking way more pictures than ever before. They just don't happen to be on film anymore. And you're still holding a device to your face, communicating with it. It just doesn't happen to be voice all that much anymore. The job to be done hasn't changed. And what I postulate and you want to look into is that the challenges is not the disruptor, but as Walt Kelly in his comic Pogo in the 1970s once said, we have met the enemy and he is us. The question becomes, what makes companies stumble over their own 2 feet? And that is a much more interesting question to ponder and to think about, I do believe. Now, I leave you with the last framework, because we believe disruption is what we call a state change. State changes is this construct out of physics, where if you take, for example, water, when it's frozen, it's solid. And then it warms and becomes liquid. It becomes actual water. And then you heat it further and it becomes gas. And the in-between is the state change. But the important thing is that these state changes happen not linearly. They happen in these like weird, somewhat exponential curves. And the underlying molecule, water, the job to be done never changes. So when you look at these individual changes, these states, say, for example, the age of Blockbuster, there's always a phase of stability. This is where you reap in all the benefits, you make all the money. If you're a startup, it's really hard to disrupt. And then there's a moment where the world is changing, and it's changing gradually. It's changing slowly. This is where you want to look out for the weak signals. This is where Blockbuster should have looked at, wow, like DVDs are coming, and DVDs are actually much smaller, and DVDs you can put into an envelope. And when you can put them into an envelope, you can ship them. And once you've done all of that, then of course there's another state, which is streaming, and you need to figure out what that looks like, because there's always the movement from gradual to sudden change. And again, I postulate that it is in your hands, in your arms, in your ability to create the change you want to see in the world. You don't need to look at the disruptors, look at your own business. I leave you with the last quote. This is a friend of ours, Ron Shake. He's the founder of Panera Bread, highly successful, healthy fast food chain in the United States. I asked him, Ron, how did you become so successful? And he said something really profound to me. He said that our approach has always been to discover today what matters tomorrow, and then transform our company into a future that is unfolding before us. And I do believe that is what you have to do, my friends. This is what it is. What is required of us as leaders, figuring out what matters tomorrow, seeing the weak signals, painting the picture, and then transforming the company into the future. That is what I had for you. If you want to be in touch with me, send an email to this email address. We've got a little bot. That little bot will send you automatically back an email with my personal contact details, with my LinkedIn, etc. I would love to stay in touch with you. Also, we share all our research on a public mailing list. We will add you to that mailing list so you can stay in touch and learn what we are learning. And with that being said, the future is unwritten. Create the future you want to create. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of this wonderful conference.